Welcome to The Tax Factor, the top 20 business and investment podcast from Blick Rothenberg, the tax, accounting and business advisory firm. Election Special with Heather Sell and Robert Salter.
Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
The Tax Factor, Election 24.
Welcome to The Tax Factor, the top 20 business and investment podcast from Blick Rothenberg, which brings you all the latest that's happening in the world of tax. I'm Heather Self.
And I'm Robert Salter.
So we are going to have a general election, as Nimesh predicted in last week's podcast. The UK is heading to the polls on July the 4th, and tax is already one of the key topics for discussion. Even a week in, who pays it, how much, and on what has been a really big part of the conversation for everyone. So over the next few weeks, we'll bring you our thoughts on the tax policies of each of the parties, what's been said, what's not being said, and what the impact might be on you and your business. It won't all be politics. We will try to bring you any giant marshmallow updates as and when they happen. And just in case it rains, we've taken the sensible option of recording the show in the studio, so we won't be getting too wet. I'm going to start by just giving a bit of fiscal background, and then I'll turn to Robert, who's going to discuss one or two of the things that the Conservatives have said so far. So both parties have made a commitment to get debt down as a proportion of GDP. So that's tying themselves up in quite a major constraint. For the Conservatives, it's getting total debt down as a proportion of GDP. Labour, I think, have left themselves a bit more wriggle room because I think they can have a bit more capital spending. And conveniently, both of them are promising to get debt down by year 5. So that gives them plenty of time to get there. But it is quite tight. One of the theories as to why an election's being called now is that perhaps Jeremy Hunt wasn't going to be able to give us any more tax cuts, even if they had had an autumn statement in September. We'll never know. There's also a lot of spending pressures, not just the NHS, but the prison service, schools that are crumbling, the justice service, all sorts of pressures on spending. And both parties are quite keen to tell us how much tax they're going to cut rather than how much they're going to raise. So I think it's going to be interesting, and we'll be keeping a close eye on it. We haven't seen any manifestos yet, so that will let us talk in more detail. But we have heard quite a few things about what they have said they're going to do. So to you first, Robert, the Conservatives, what are the things that they've mentioned so far?
Well, they've mentioned 2 or 3 things. So some of these are, ideas they've mentioned before and things like that. But obviously, Jeremy Hunt called in IHT kind of unconservative, and in effect, kind of promising to get rid of it. That's the way the Tories have been doing it for a number of years already. So I'm not sure that will actually happen, because it is actually quite a useful cash cow for them, and it doesn't actually impact most estates. But it is potentially a natural differentiator between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and it may well be something which appeals disproportionately to their base, because a lot of people think they may be liable to IHT, or they could be liable to it. So it might be a relatively easy thing to talk about without actually having to deliver, and may get you some votes.
And they've mentioned reducing taxes on labour income, and I think that's a hint of them wanting to go further on cutting national insurance. And as the Labour Party have pointed out, if they do abolish national insurance altogether, then that's a 46 billion hole in their overall budget arithmetic. I really can't see it ever happening.
It can't happen fundamentally, because if you got rid of employee NIC and self-employed NIC, which is, the ideal that they want, that is basically the same cost to the Kwarteng budget that was unfunded 2 or 3 years ago. We all know what happened there and the disaster that was. So if they had to get rid of 45, 46 billion from NICs, well, where else are they going to either be capturing it, or where are they going to be cutting costs? And as you said at the start, there's so much that they need to spend money on, and they promised to spend money on, and that needs to have proper investment. So yeah, it's a fantasy.
One other thing that Jeremy Hunt said in an article in the papers last weekend was how much he wants to get rid of these ridiculous marginal rates for people who are on over 50,000 or over 100,000. Once you get over 100,000, the personal allowance gets withdrawn. And I think the problem that the Conservatives have got generally is people say to them, well, why haven't you done this over the last 14 years?
Absolutely. They've created those problems. They're very much their problems. When you talk about child benefit, for example, everybody, when it came in 2013, anybody in tax highlighted it was appalling policy. It didn't work particularly effectively. It was cumbersome, hard to manage. The education about it then was also very poor. And, it was always going to catch more and more people. people. Now, they made, one or two tiny changes in the last budget, and that helped a wee bit along the margins and things like that. And obviously, they hope to kind of make it family-based in due course, but that is going to be incredibly difficult to manage anyway, and it won't totally eliminate the problem. It just kind of pushes it some ways further down the road and to slightly smaller groups of people, but it doesn't eliminate it. So I think at the moment they are kind of firefighting when it comes to tax. And if you say something and that's, oh, actually, yes, it's right, they kind of address it, but they don't really have any idea where they're going. And he mentioned one or two areas where you've got these anomalies, but there's other anomalies out there that he hasn't even mentioned, so he's presumably not aware of. Whether it's the 55% tax rate you can have when you're on social benefits and you work a few extra hours, for example. If you say 45% is too high a tax rate, 55% must be too high a tax rate.
Absolutely. The one specific policy they came out with earlier this week was a new additional personal allowance for pensioners. Now, I think this is a great idea. It's going to give my husband and I another £100 a year each fairly soon. So that's great. And that's, of course, exactly the effect he's hoping to have. What he seems to have forgotten is that we used to have an age-related personal allowance. It got abolished by a chancellor who I think went by the name of George Osborne. And if I remember rightly, I think he was a Conservative. So this is really going round in circles. And also, I think finally they've achieved something that they haven't managed to get anyone to notice for a long time, which is understanding what fiscal drag means. We've been going on for months about the fact that freezing personal allowances means that more people get dragged into tax or dragged into higher rates of tax. And suddenly, a whole lot of pensioners have noticed that they're going to end up with a state pension that's taxable. Oh, look, here's a problem that we've created. Now let's find a way to solve it. So not terribly impressed with that one, although, as I say, personally, it's quite nice. And then finally, Robert, they're going to raise another $6 billion from cracking down on avoidance and evasion. Whoopee!
Yes, I think it's more in the kind of, it'd be lovely if it happened. And in some ways you think, okay, it's only $6 billion, given that the tax gap for HMRC is meant to be 35, 36 billion. So there's two ways of looking at it. One, if they get $6 billion, that's great. And that's basically in very simple terms, 1p on the basic rate of income tax. So nice figure. But realistically, we all know how underfunded HMRC is, how badly resourced HMRC is, the fact that they can't get the skilled staff they need. So the reality, the chances of them getting the $6 billion, I think, are very, very unlikely. And again, the problem in most cases is what I would call small scale. It's somebody taking some cash in hand over there, somebody not necessarily registering for VAT over there. It's the sort of things where the biggest chunk of this tax gap is in very small scale, individually, small scale stuff. So it's actually quite hard to challenge. It's not a big four firm selling X or for selling Y, which doesn't work. So it's going to be hard for them to actually achieve in practice, I'm afraid.
Yeah. If I had a free pack of Jaffa cakes for every time a government had promised to crack down on avoidance and evasion, I'd be eating a lot of Jaffa cakes. To be fair, Labour have also said they'll raise $6 billion by reducing the tax gap, but their plan is at least a bit more detailed, and they have talked about putting more resources into HMRC, doing more on digital transformation and actually getting compliance better. I'm still not completely convinced that will bring them in $6 billion, but it does look to be a bit better thought through.
I agree, there's a strategy there, at least, an incomplete strategy, and like I say, talking about it and, for example, trying to have more staff, great things, but then there's all the issue about training them, retaining them, getting the right people in and things like that. And, I heard a couple of weeks ago that actually a third of HMRC staff are on the minimum wage.
There's an awful lot of very junior people in there, and actually what they lack are some good experienced people, perhaps.
Yeah.
The one specific thing that Labour have said, now, generally, Labour have said they're not going to do an emergency budget straight after the election, so we're not expecting to have another budget in July. But they could come out with one or two announcements on specific things, and I think top of the list is probably VAT on school fees.
Yes, so this is one that's close to my heart on the basis I have a son that does go to a private school, and so obviously it will impact us directly. And, he's actually just turned 11, so he's going to be actually going into senior school come September. And, we did actually look at the options and saying, do we want to pay this VAT? Can we get him into the one decent school in the area, for example? Do we need to move house and things like that? So I think that's the sort of discussion a lot of other people are going to be having at the present time. Now, in some ways, we're lucky that we only had one. So, we can afford to bear, say, 15% on top of those school fees. But, if we had two, it would be in a different situation.
This is one where I went to an IFS CIOT discussion on the topic, and it seems to me that it is going to happen. So I think it's about what's the impact going to be and what are people going to do. And I think one concern is that I'm hearing a lot about schemes being sold to get round the VAT on school fees. Are you going to do any of those, Robert?
No, I'm naturally cautious as an accountant anyway, but I think the reality is, even if you pay in advance, and traditionally with VAT, it's the payment dates, which is the kind of the starting point. I can imagine a lot of those being attached impact as in anti-avoidance measures or something like that. It's relatively easy to kind of imagine what they could be. But there's also practical issues in terms of, even if I had spare cash today, what happens if the school closes? What happens if we have to move or something like that? Then that money's tied up. So practically, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place. And I think I just prefer to play safe.
I absolutely agree with you there, Rob. I think entering into anything that looks like a complicated scheme, all we would say is please don't. On the paying fees in advance, to some extent, if the school gives you a discount for paying in advance and you either don't have to pay the VAT or it's no worse than it would have been, that's probably the safest option if you've got the cash available. But I do think your point about what if you move house or if the school goes bust is a hugely valid one. My children also went to private school. I used to pay the fees 1 year in advance because the discount I got was better than the interest rate I could get in the bank. But I would never do it for more than 1 year because I didn't want to put my money at risk beyond that point.
And we pay slightly in advance. So basically, we start paying like next year's fees from June, I think, in effect. So we always pay slightly in advance. But fundamentally, it's, and we get 2 or 3% discount for doing that, which is, again, better than nothing, absolutely. But yes, that's just common sense cash planning almost rather than actually tax planning.
So I think that's one that's almost certainly coming in. Labour have said quite a lot of things they're not going to do. They've committed to not raising the rates of income tax and national insurance. I don't think they are going to unfreeze the personal allowances. I think that would just be too expensive. I think they've also said they won't raise the rate of capital gains tax. But I think we will see some changes to capital gains tax, particularly the one that's in the firing line is carried interest. Can you just give us a bit of background about that one, Rob?
So basically, carried interest is in effect potentially kind of part of the compensation, for want of a better term, that people in the private equity and the venture capital industry potentially earn on some of the investments that they're involved in and things like that. Now, that's presently taxed at 28%, which is a special rate of capital gains tax, but it's taxed as capital gains rather than income tax. And certainly, the Labour Party has talked on and off about potentially saying that should be income in many cases. And, there's some articles to suggest actually even under the existing laws, it should often be treated as income rather than as capital gains. So I think that's a potentially easy win for the Labour Party. And, Rachel Reeves talked to the weekend about not raising income tax for regular taxpayers. Well, you can define regular taxpayers how you like, but clearly the VC funds and the PE houses are probably not what she means by regular taxpayers. So it could be an easy one politically.
I don't know how much it would raise, though. I've seen figures ranging from 500 million to 4 billion. Have you got any feel for that?
Yeah, well, I think the thing I've got is, and I've worked with a few people who are, are employed by the PE houses and things like that, and overwhelmingly they're very international in terms of their background. And I actually already deal post-COVID with quite a few clients who in effect commute. So these days, rather than just having lived in the UK fully, they literally live in Switzerland or Belgium or Holland and, spend 2 or 3 days a week in the UK. So again, some of our taxing rights there are actually disappearing as we speak anyway, because international working, flex working hasn't worked in the UK's favour in this regard. People who would have historically been here 100% of the time or 90% of the time are now much more international, much more of the time is overseas. A lot of things like the capital gains, we're actually losing the taxing rights on that anyway in many cases, because under double tax agreements are typically, treated as an O elsewhere. And so, like I say, it will raise some money, but longer term, again, a lot of these things, I think there's going to be a challenge here between the short term for Labour and what's going to happen over 3, 4, 5 years. Because in the short term, they may well say VAT on school fees or the carried interest, yes, that's a win for us. But if you ask me what's going to happen over 3, 4, 5 years when people's behaviour starts changing, people start planning and things and looking at options and moving, for example, or going into the state school sector or whatever, I think you're then starting to actually find these things being actually quite costly, not bringing income in, but losing it.
I would certainly like to see from any of the political parties a proper roadmap for tax. We had something back in, 2010, I think we had a reasonable one on business taxes. And really just setting out the direction of travel would be better, because what we're getting at the moment is lots and lots of sound bites and no real strategy for the tax system.
I totally agree with that. Now, a wee bit of that is inevitable, I think, with the pressures of the election and people kind of almost like firefighting on occasions. But I would actually argue with the Labour Party. I think they've got the option, given they should win this, whatever, of actually being honest and open and being proactive and giving a real lead on this. But again, the Tories have been in power for 14 years and they've done nothing. It has been firefighting consistently. Whether it was the non-domicile changes 7, 8 years ago, the most recent non-dom changes, whatever. They've been firefighting to try and get ahead of Labour or try and make it difficult for Labour or whatever. There has has been a lack of proper strategy, leadership, guidance, whatever you want to call it, from both main parties.
So, in summary, what we're seeing so far is some optimistic proposals to bring in money like the $6 billion from avoidance and evasion, a couple of smaller measures, that the sweeties for pensioners from the Conservatives, the VAT on school fees and possibly carried interest from Labour. But we're not seeing any radical proposals for the tax system at all. And I think probably the thing to watch out for over the coming weeks are the things that they don't say. If nobody mentions VAT, then does that mean actually we could be getting some quite significant changes to VAT? It's going to be an interesting ride. And as I said at the beginning, hopefully we should have the manifestos themselves in a couple of weeks.
I think we will have some tax rises, I think, coming down the line somewhere. There has to be. VAT or things like insurance premium tax, often hidden taxes people don't really pick up on. So I think in some ways they're easy taxes for people to raise without it being kind of picked up as a tax rise in the way an income tax rise would be kind of foreseen and things like that.
And finally, Robert, if there was one thing that politicians could promise that might make you vote for them, is there anything on tax that would really cheer you up?
I would genuinely actually want to see them proactively address the anomalies in the system. So whether that's the 55% tax for those on social benefits, whether it's the personal allowance withdrawal or child benefit clawback, all of those obscene anomalies in the system which are just so unfair and so unjust. And so in many cases, it's easy to change. I'd really want to see those abolished because you can do it. It's just a matter of will.
That's a great answer, Robert. And while I entirely agree with you, I'm going to be much more flippant. I'd like to see 0 rating on gin because I think we might need a large one over the next few weeks.
Especially on the 4th of July, whilst we're waiting up until 2 o'clock in the morning, or the 5th of July by then.
Absolutely.
The Tax Factor. Election 24.
Well, that's about all for this episode. If you want a break from the election, you might find our documentary series, Success Stories, of interest. Each episode talks to a successful entrepreneur about their journey to success and their advice to other businesses and fellow entrepreneurs. In the latest episode, audit, accounting and outsourcing partner Daniel Burke talks with Dino Sura, the managing director of the global restaurant business Burger & Lobster, who tells their story, how it all began and the challenges they've faced over the last 13 years.
Next week, Nimesh Shah and Roger Holman will be here and looking at the tax plans of each party. It's goodbye from me, Robert Salter.
And it's goodbye from me, Heather Self. Thanks for listening and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
That's the Tax Factor. We'd like to thank you for making us one of the UK's top 20 podcasts. Find all our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And join us again next time on the Tax Factor.